It does not arrive with noise or warning or a clear moment that can be pointed to later and named with certainty. It arrives quietly, almost politely, as a feeling that something has shifted without ever announcing itself as a loss, a sense that decisions still happen, but they no longer feel anchored where they once were. That the motion of choosing has become lighter, thinner, as if it is happening slightly ahead of you or slightly around you, rather than inside you. And at first there is no alarm, because nothing dramatic has occurred and nothing has been taken by force. The days still move forward, routines still unfold, conversations still happen, and on the surface life appears intact. But beneath that surface, there is a faint detachment from the act of deciding that once felt natural and unquestioned, a subtle gap between what happens and the inner confirmation that it was truly chosen. It begins in small, almost invisible ways, in moments that seem too minor to resist or even notice. When someone suggests an easier option and it feels reasonable to accept it, when a preference is softened into indifference because it no longer feels worth the effort to clarify it, when a question is answered for you before you have finished forming the thought, and none of this feels hostile or intentional, it feels efficient, considerate, even caring, and that is why it passes through unnoticed. There is a quiet sense of relief at first, a sense that some weight has been lifted, that there is less to manage, fewer decisions to carry, and that relief is real and understandable because choosing requires energy and attention and presence, and those are not infinite, especially as time reshapes the body and the pace of days changes. Yet somewhere inside, beneath the relief, there is a faint discomfort that does not yet have language, a sense that ease has replaced something more substantial, something that once affirmed existence in a way that comfort never quite does. It is not that you are told you cannot decide. It is that the opportunity to decide quietly recedes, like a chair being pulled back just as you are about to sit, and you adjust without comment because adjusting has become second nature. You begin to notice that decisions now arrive already framed, already narrowed, already filtered through what others believe is appropriate or safe or practical. And while these frames are not wrong, they are not neutral either. And over time, they begin to shape not only what happens, but how you think about what could have happened. There is a subtle shift in language that accompanies this. Words like easier and better and safer begin to replace words like want and prefer and choose. And language matters because it carries assumptions about who holds authority and where responsibility lives, and when language shifts, perception follows quietly behind it. You may notice that when you hesitate, someone steps in to fill the pause, not out of impatience but out of habit. And that pause was once the space where your decision would have formed, but now it is treated as a gap that needs to be closed, a silence that needs assistance. And so the moment passes, and with it, the chance to practice choosing. There is no single day when this becomes obvious, no event that marks the transition, because autonomy does not vanish all at once. It thins, it fades, it becomes less exercised and therefore less visible. And what is not exercised eventually feels less essential. You might still say yes and no, but the weight of those words feels different now, lighter, less consequential, as if they are being spoken within boundaries already set by others, boundaries that feel reasonable enough that they do not provoke resistance. This is how awareness begins, not with outrage or clarity, but with a quiet, unsettled noticing. A sense that the center of gravity has shifted just enough to be felt, but not enough to be named. You may find yourself replaying small moments afterward, wondering why you agreed so quickly, why you did not pause longer, why your own preference seemed to dissolve before it was fully expressed. And these questions arise not from regret, but from curiosity, from an emerging recognition that something internal has changed. The world has not become overtly controlling. People have not become cruel or dismissive, and that is precisely why the shift is so difficult to identify, because it is wrapped in good intentions and gentle concern, and resisting good intentions feels unnecessary, even ungrateful. Yet dignity does not erode through cruelty alone. It erodes through subtle reassignments of agency that feel harmless in isolation but accumulate over time. There is a moment, often quiet and easily missed, when you realize that people have begun to anticipate your needs and preferences without checking if those anticipations still align with who you are. And anticipation can feel like care, but it can also become a replacement for listening. You may notice that choices are now discussed around you rather than with you, that plans are adjusted in your presence without your input, and that your silence is interpreted as agreement rather than as a space for thought. This is not because your voice no longer matters, but because it has not been required as often, and what is not required is easily overlooked. Awareness emerges slowly, through a growing sensitivity to these moments, through an internal recognition that while nothing has been taken outright, something has been assumed away. And assumptions are powerful because they operate without confrontation. You may begin to feel a quiet distance between your inner sense of self and the role you are being placed into, a role defined by limitation rather than capacity, by protection rather than participation. And this distance creates a subtle tension that lingers beneath everyday interactions. There is a feeling of being slightly out of sync with the way decisions unfold around you, as if you are watching the process from half a step back, included but not central, present but not primary. This is not yet loss, but it is the threshold of it, the early awareness that autonomy is not a static possession, but a living process that depends on continued engagement. And when engagement decreases, autonomy does not protest, it simply recedes. The realization does not arrive as a conclusion, but as a quiet question that forms in the background of ordinary days. A question that asks, when was the last time a decision felt fully yours from beginning to end? Not because you insisted on it, not because you defended it, but because it arose naturally from your own sense of direction. That question lingers without demanding an answer, and its presence marks the beginning of awareness, the moment when something unnamed becomes perceptible, when the absence of something once taken for granted begins to register not as a crisis, but as a subtle absence, like a room that feels slightly emptier without anything visibly missing. At some point, the quiet awareness sharpens into recognition, not through a sudden revelation, but through repetition, through the accumulation of moments that begin to resemble each other too closely to ignore. And it becomes clear that what once felt like isolated conveniences are part of a pattern that has its own logic and momentum. You start to see how assistance arrives before consent, how suggestions arrive already weighted with expectation, how concern subtly carries authority beneath its surface, and this recognition does not feel accusatory or bitter. It feels sober, almost clinical, as if you are finally noticing the structure of something that has been operating in plain sight. You notice how help rarely announces itself as control, how it arrives dressed as relief, how it speaks softly and uses reasonable words, and how easily it slips into place because it appears to solve a problem that no one wants to carry for too long. There is a realization that help, once accepted without reflection, begins to define the perimeter of your participation, not because anyone intends to diminish you, but because systems and relationships naturally reorganize around what is easiest and most efficient, and autonomy is rarely the most efficient option. You recognize that once others begin to manage details on your behalf, those details are no longer returned easily, and the act of choosing quietly migrates outward, settling into routines that no longer require your presence. You see how questions gradually turn into statements, how options narrow without being discussed, how phrases like "you do not need to worry about that" or "we will take care of it" appear more often, and how these phrases feel comforting even as they quietly relocate authority. Recognition brings with it a subtle discomfort because it reveals complicity, not blame but participation, the understanding that this shift has been facilitated not only by others but by moments of fatigue, by the desire for simplicity, by the natural human tendency to conserve energy when offered an alternative. You recognize that the pattern is reinforced by politeness, by the wish not to be difficult, by the unspoken rule that declining help requires justification while accepting it does not. And over time, this imbalance trains everyone involved to move in one direction. You begin to notice how concern can become a kind of permission slip, how worry expressed by others subtly authorizes them to step in, to adjust, to decide, and how once worry is voiced, resistance feels unreasonable, even reckless. There is an unspoken assumption embedded in these interactions that caution equals wisdom and autonomy equals risk, and while that assumption is not always false, it becomes limiting when applied indiscriminately. Recognition involves seeing how language itself participates in this process, how words soften responsibility and redistribute it quietly, how saying it might be too much for you carries a conclusion within it, how saying let us handle that closes a door without appearing to do so. You start to hear how your own responses have adapted, how agreement has become quicker, how explanations have become shorter, how preferences are expressed with qualifiers, and this adaptation feels practical until it begins to feel like erosion. There is a recognition that patterns do not require villains to exist, that they persist through momentum rather than malice, and that good intentions can be as effective as force when they go unexamined. You notice how routines now operate independently of your input, how decisions follow established tracks that no longer pause for reflection, and how breaking these routines would require effort that feels disproportionate to the outcome, and so they continue. Recognition is not dramatic, it is quiet and almost disappointing, because it reveals that nothing dramatic needs to happen for autonomy to thin, that it can fade within normality, within care, within systems designed to help. You begin to see how the role assigned to you has subtly changed, how expectations have shifted downward without being discussed, how capability is no longer assumed by default, but evaluated before being granted, and how this evaluation happens subtly, through tone and timing, rather than explicit judgment. You recognize that once others begin to monitor your choices, even lightly, your choices begin to respond to that monitoring, adjusting themselves to avoid friction. And this adjustment happens internally, long before anyone notices it externally. There is an understanding that recognition itself carries weight, that seeing the pattern changes how future moments are experienced, that once you notice how help becomes control through repetition rather than decree, it is difficult to unsee it. You may recognize that the most powerful aspect of this process is its invisibility, the way it allows everyone involved to feel reasonable and kind, the way it avoids confrontation entirely, and how avoidance itself becomes the mechanism of change. You see how being protected gradually replaces being trusted, how being accommodated gradually replaces being consulted, and how these substitutions feel benign until their cumulative effect becomes apparent. Recognition brings a certain clarity that is not yet empowering, not yet stabilizing, but honest. A clarity that names the dynamic without assigning blame, that acknowledges how easily dignity can be reframed as inconvenience, how easily autonomy can be interpreted as stubbornness once a narrative of care is established. You begin to recognize moments when you are spoken about in your presence rather than spoken with, moments when plans are adjusted with a glance rather than a question, moments when your silence is filled in on your behalf, and these moments no longer pass unnoticed. There is an emerging awareness that recognition does not require confrontation, that simply seeing the pattern alters the internal landscape, creating a quiet tension between acceptance and agency that did not exist before. You recognize that once others believe they know what is best for you, their certainty grows through repetition, reinforced by your compliance, and that this certainty becomes self-sustaining, no longer requiring validation. Recognition reveals how difficult it is to reinsert oneself into a process that has learned to operate without pause, how resistance feels awkward, not because it is wrong but because it disrupts a smooth system. You begin to understand that the issue is not help itself, but the absence of consent within it, not care, but the assumption that care replaces choice, and this understanding settles slowly, without urgency, without demands, simply present as a new way of seeing interactions that once felt neutral. Recognition is the moment when the pattern becomes visible enough to be named internally, when you can trace the quiet path from concern to control without needing to dramatize it, when you can acknowledge how easily autonomy is traded for ease without ever being explicitly negotiated. This recognition does not yet restore anything. It does not resolve the tension it creates, but it changes the relationship to what is happening. And that change, though subtle, marks a turning point, the moment when the quiet loss of decision-making is no longer invisible, when it becomes something that can be felt, observed, and held in awareness, even if nothing outward changes yet. There comes a point when recognition settles into something heavier, when the pattern that was once merely observed begins to register emotionally. And this is where loss quietly makes itself known, not as a dramatic rupture, but as a persistent weight that colors interactions and self-perception alike. The loss is not announced. It does not arrive with grief or outrage. It arrives as a gradual repositioning, a sense of being shifted sideways in the social and emotional architecture of your own life, moved from the center of decisions to the perimeter where observation replaces participation. You begin to feel how being managed differs from being consulted, how guidance offered without invitation carries a different texture, and how tone itself becomes a marker of status, softer perhaps, slower, more careful, but also less reciprocal. There is a moment when you notice people speaking to you as if explaining rather than exchanging, as if clarity must now be delivered rather than discovered together, and this difference, though subtle, lands with quiet force. Loss shows itself in how your presence is interpreted, how your silence is filled in, how your hesitations are read as incapacity rather than thoughtfulness, and how your confidence is measured against assumptions rather than experience. You may feel a quiet shrinking of space, not physical, but conversational and psychological, a narrowing of where your voice naturally fits, and this shrinking does not provoke immediate resistance because it feels socially awkward to contest something that arrives wrapped in care. There is a particular ache in realizing that the way you are addressed has changed, that questions once asked openly are now softened or bypassed, that decisions once shared are now delivered as conclusions, and that this change is rarely acknowledged directly, as if naming it would make it impolite. Loss carries with it a strange invisibility, because from the outside nothing appears wrong, and from the inside it is difficult to articulate without sounding ungrateful or defensive, and so it is often carried alone. You may notice that your own language adapts further, that you explain less, that you concede faster, that you preemptively simplify your preferences to avoid complication. And this self-editing becomes a form of quiet compliance that deepens the repositioning. There is a sense of being gently escorted away from complexity, from risk, from the full range of decision-making that once affirmed your agency. And while this escort is framed as protection, it also communicates a revised expectation of who you are allowed to be. Loss is felt in moments when you realize that people no longer wait for your response, that the rhythm of conversation moves on without pause, that decisions are finalized in your presence without requiring your confirmation, and that your role has shifted from originator to recipient. There is an emotional toll in being anticipated rather than asked, in being accommodated rather than engaged, because accommodation implies limitation, whereas engagement assumes capacity. You may feel a quiet disorientation, a sense that your internal sense of self no longer matches the external role being assigned, and this mismatch creates a subtle friction that drains energy over time. Loss is also felt in how mistakes are now treated, how small missteps are remembered longer, how caution is retroactively justified, and how these moments are woven into a narrative that further legitimizes oversight. You may sense a growing gap between who you know yourself to be and how you're being perceived, and this gap can feel isolating because it is not openly contested. It is simply absorbed into the way things are done now. There is a particular sadness in realizing that dignity fades before strength, that you can still be capable while being subtly repositioned as fragile, and that once this perception takes hold, it reshapes interactions in ways that are difficult to reverse. Loss is not only external, it is internal as well, because repeated deference teaches the self to stand back, to wait, to accept. And over time, this stance can feel strangely familiar, even comfortable, until you notice how much has been surrendered. You may feel a quiet grief for the version of yourself who moved freely through decisions without having to justify or defend them, who was assumed competent by default, who was trusted to assess risk without supervision. And this grief does not demand expression because it feels disproportionate to the subtlety of the changes that caused it. Loss shows itself in how your time is now managed, how schedules are adjusted for you, how your energy is predicted rather than asked about, and how these adjustments, though well-meaning, communicate a revised authority over your life. There is a heaviness in realizing that people now speak on your behalf in settings where you are present, that they summarize your needs and preferences as if translating, and that this translation subtly replaces your own voice. You may feel a quiet resentment that you do not want to own, because resentment feels inappropriate in the face of care, and so it turns inward, becoming a muted dissatisfaction that has no clear outlet. Loss is experienced in the cumulative effect of being repositioned emotionally, socially, linguistically, and over time this repositioning begins to affect how you see yourself, how readily you assert, how quickly you withdraw. There is a sense of being managed through concern, of being guided through life with a lighter grip on the reins, and while this may reduce friction, it also reduces authorship. You may notice that your sense of initiative dulls, not because it is gone, but because it is no longer required, and what is not required gradually loses its sharpness. Loss feels like being spoken to differently, like being handled with care that borders on caution, like being considered before being consulted, and this difference, though subtle, accumulates emotional weight. There is an internal reckoning that happens when you realize that the role you are being placed into is not temporary, that it is becoming the default, and that reversing it would require a disruption you may not feel ready to create. Loss is the recognition that autonomy has been quietly exchanged for smoothness, that dignity has been softened into safety, and that this exchange was never negotiated explicitly. You may feel a quiet longing for friction, for the kind of resistance that affirms presence, because friction implies agency, and its absence, while comfortable, can feel erasing. Loss is not dramatic. It does not demand tears or declarations. It settles into the body as a subtle heaviness, a background awareness that something essential has been reduced without being removed, that the world has shifted its expectations of you in ways that feel premature, and that this shift carries emotional consequences that are rarely acknowledged. There is a deep, quiet sorrow in realizing that once people stop asking, they rarely start again on their own, and that the invitation to choose must now be reclaimed rather than assumed, and this realization marks the deepest layer of loss, the understanding that what has been repositioned externally has also begun to reposition internally, and that reclaiming it will require something more than recognition, something more than awareness, something that has not yet arrived but is beginning to take shape in the quiet space left by what has been lost. Clarity does not arrive as a surge of resolve or a declaration of intent. It arrives quietly, almost without sensation, as a settling of perspective that feels less like gaining something new and more like recognizing what was never truly gone. It emerges not from confrontation, but from stillness, from sitting with the weight of what has shifted and allowing understanding to form without rushing it toward action. Clarity begins with the realization that autonomy was never fully housed in schedules or permissions or the visible act of deciding, but in the internal posture taken toward those things, in the quiet ownership of thought that precedes expression. There is a calm understanding that while roles can be reassigned and expectations adjusted and language softened around you, there remains a place within that cannot be entered without invitation, a place where judgment, consent, and meaning still reside. This understanding does not provoke urgency. It produces steadiness, a sense that something essential has remained intact despite external repositioning. Clarity reveals that autonomy does not require constant assertion to exist, that it is not dependent on volume or insistence, and that its erosion only becomes permanent when internal authority is surrendered alongside external control. You begin to see that while others may decide logistics, routines, and outcomes, they cannot decide interpretation, cannot determine what you accept internally as true or necessary, and this distinction matters more than it first appears. There is a recognition that dignity is not granted by being asked. It is maintained by knowing when an answer still belongs to you, even if it is not spoken aloud. Clarity shows that the most significant decisions are not always visible, that choosing how you understand your role, your capacity, your relevance, happens internally long before it manifests outwardly. You may realize that while participation has narrowed, awareness has widened, that the quiet observation of how things unfold has sharpened discernment, and that discernment itself is a form of agency that cannot be removed without your consent. There is a calm acceptance that not every decision needs to be reclaimed to preserve autonomy, That autonomy is not measured by how many choices you make, but by whether the core sense of authorship remains intact. Clarity brings an understanding that resistance is not always necessary, that pushing back externally can sometimes reinforce the very narrative of fragility you wish to avoid, and that silence, when chosen rather than imposed, can be an expression of strength rather than withdrawal. You begin to see that internal authority does not announce itself, that it does not require validation, and that it operates most effectively when it is settled rather than reactive. There is a recognition that while the world may have adjusted its expectations, you are not obligated to internalize those adjustments as definitions of who you are. Clarity reveals that autonomy lives in how you assess risk privately, how you hold preferences internally even when they are not expressed, how you remain capable of choosing even when the opportunity is not offered. You may notice a quiet shift in how you listen, a deeper attention to tone and implication, a heightened awareness of when decisions are being framed for you, and this awareness itself becomes a form of control because it prevents unconscious surrender. There is a sense that the loss experienced earlier was not absolute but partial, that something essential remained untouched, waiting not to be reclaimed through force, but recognized through understanding. Clarity allows you to see that dignity is not restored by demanding it from others, but by refusing to relinquish it internally, by maintaining a clear boundary between assistance and authorship in your own mind. You understand that autonomy is not a performance, it is a position, and that this position can be held quietly even when circumstances appear to limit it. There is a calm acknowledgement that others will continue to decide certain things, that systems will continue to prioritize efficiency, that concern will continue to express itself through management, and that none of this requires a constant response. Clarity brings relief not because control is regained externally, but because the internal locus of control is recognized and stabilized. You may feel a subtle return of steadiness, not excitement, not empowerment in the dramatic sense, but a grounded sense of knowing where authority truly resides. There is an understanding that what cannot be taken unless surrendered is the right to interpret, to consent internally, to maintain self-respect regardless of circumstance. Clarity reframes autonomy not as a series of battles to be fought, but as a state to be inhabited, one that does not depend on permission or recognition. You see that while others may assume, anticipate, and manage, they cannot fully occupy the space where meaning is assigned unless you allow it. This understanding settles quietly, without ceremony, without urgency, and it marks a turning point not because it changes the world immediately, but because it stabilizes the self within it. Clarity is the moment when the quiet loss stops feeling irreversible, when the internal posture shifts from passive adaptation to conscious presence, when autonomy is understood not as something to be reclaimed from others, but as something to be preserved within, regardless of how the external landscape continues to evolve. Quiet autonomy does not announce itself and does not require recognition. It settles into the body as a new posture that feels both familiar and deliberate, a way of standing internally that does not seek permission or provoke resistance. It is not a return to how things were, because time does not reverse and roles do not easily dissolve, but it is a refinement of how you inhabit what remains. Quiet autonomy is the decision not to correct every assumption, not to reclaim every small choice outwardly, but to remain internally aligned with your own sense of authorship, even when the surface of life appears guided by others. It is the understanding that control does not need to be visible to be real, that dignity does not require validation, and that self-respect can be maintained without confrontation. There is a calm acceptance that others may continue to manage certain aspects of your life, and that this management does not automatically define your worth or capacity unless you allow it to do so internally. Quiet autonomy expresses itself in how you listen without absorbing, how you accept assistance without relinquishing identity, how you move through routines without forgetting that they are circumstances rather than definitions. It is present in the way you pause internally before agreeing, even if agreement still comes, in the way you notice when a decision has been made for you, and choose consciously how to relate to that fact rather than reacting automatically. There is a subtle reclaiming of agency that happens without any outward change, a reclaiming that occurs in thought, in interpretation, in the refusal to let external management rewrite your internal narrative. Quiet autonomy does not seek to be seen as capable. It knows capacity without needing to prove it, and this knowledge creates a steadiness that is not easily disrupted by tone or assumption. You may find that you no longer rush to correct how others perceive you, that you no longer feel compelled to demonstrate competence at every turn, because your sense of self no longer depends on their acknowledgement. Quiet autonomy allows you to accept limits without internalizing diminishment, to recognize changes in energy or pace without translating them into loss of self. There is a freedom in this, not the freedom of expansion, but the freedom of containment, the freedom of knowing where the self begins and ends, regardless of circumstance. Quiet autonomy is maintained through awareness rather than assertion, through a steady presence that does not need to argue its right to exist. You may notice that decisions feel different now, even when they are not yours to make externally, because your relationship to them has changed. You are no longer displaced by them, no longer reduced by their absence. There is a quiet refusal to disappear into the roles assigned, a refusal enacted not through protest, but through continued internal engagement with the world as a thinking, choosing being. Quiet autonomy is visible only to the one who holds it, and that invisibility is part of its strength, because it cannot be easily challenged or overridden. It is the choice to remain mentally present in conversations, even when your input is not solicited. The choice to retain opinions without the need to voice them constantly. The choice to value your own judgment, even when it is not exercised publicly. There is a subtle dignity in this stance, a dignity that does not rely on independence as performance, but on independence as orientation. Quiet autonomy does not seek to restore the past. It seeks to inhabit the present with integrity, acknowledging reality without surrendering meaning. You may find that the weight experienced earlier begins to lift slightly, not because circumstances have changed, but because your internal position has stabilized, and stability brings relief. Quiet autonomy allows you to navigate a world that means well without being consumed by it, to accept care without becoming defined by it, to move through managed spaces without losing authorship of the self. There is no announcement when this posture is adopted, no moment of declaration. It simply becomes the way you relate to what unfolds. Quiet autonomy is the understanding that while others may decide for you at times, they cannot decide who you are unless you relinquish that authority, and this understanding becomes a quiet anchor that holds steady beneath the surface of daily life. It is the final, silent ownership of choice, thought, and self-respect, carried without display, without conflict, and without the need for acknowledgement, a form